Hello everyone and welcome to this commentary video. This one is going to be covering some of the assigned readings, in particular scientific censorship, how and why it might be happening, an interesting investigation of that, and also a consideration of some of the ethical concerns of leveraging AI in healthcare. Both of these topics are relevant to the project and the goals of this course as we think about how to make use of health communication information for our personal health and wellness. Specifically, in relation to these readings, I want to make sure we're considering a couple key questions. Kind of simple, straightforward, but this gets complicated quickly. One, what are the challenges with generating reliable knowledge in biomedicine? And what are the solutions that we can provide to that, or what can we imagine to help with this? What are some of the challenges also in using AI in medical settings? And what are the solutions we can provide that might help us address those challenges? And ultimately, we want to know what the role of communication might play in improving both of these areas. Let's get into it. When we get down to it, both of these articles, what they have in common is they're talking about bias and generating knowledge and information for our consumption. One is talking about human bias in the case of scientific censorship, which may not even be a concept you've even thought of before. I guess it gets some play in politics these days, but we'll get into that. And also bias that's generated by machines. And so that's an emerging area of concern. It is quickly changing and outpacing our ability to cope with it. So we want to come up with some solutions that allow us to get out ahead of that and think about what might be coming down the line. We need to be aware of how we could deal with each. Even though they seem totally different, well, we might be dealing with the product of both of those when we're trying to approximate knowledge from what exists out there and start applying it to our lives. Let's begin with the Clark et al. Article on scientific censorship. And so here is an image that I thought was probably worth us looking at. This is coming directly from the paper, kind of illustrating what might be happening sometimes in the peer review process. So when they say scientific censorship, this is what they mean. They're saying that you've got all of the evidence, the totality of evidence, what we know, what has been studied, what's available for us to analyze and look at. But then you also have this subset of that stuff, which is the peer-reviewed published literature. The problem here is much like when journalists are translating scientific information for the general public to process, there is a distillation that occurs in the peer review process. The concern is that it's not objective, that distillation is motivated by some sort of bias. This is a common problem in the academy. It's one of those things that people criticize about the academy, and it's a valid criticism. There is indeed scientific bias that reflects both political ideas, that reflects the norms of what has been going on in a given field over time. It reflects the biases of the people who are prominent figures in that field. There's a lot of pride involved, and that's a problem, right? Because science, the whole point of science is that it's objective and it helps us approximate the truth. But as this picture illustrates, the truth might be a little squishier, a little different than what is presented sometimes. And just having a peer-reviewed process doesn't solve that problem if it doesn't have some sort of accountability and transparency. So that's what we're talking about here. What is happening? What are the arguments of the authors? Essentially, they are revealing through their analysis, they're saying, well, we tend to think of this as malicious. We tend to think of censorship as this like dark, shadowy, ill-intentioned, powerful people doing things in secret. Sometimes that's true. Hey, sometimes it is true, right? But more likely, we are probably seeing the result of pro-social motives. That means the bias is towards protecting social things, not necessarily like power or anything like that. I like to summarize pretty much any observation that has to do with human nature in the following way. Most people are mostly good most of the time. And so that leaves a whole lot of wiggle room in terms of when they will not be so good. And so our goal, if we agree to that, initial premise, our goal is to create more context where people can be good. if that's what we want them to be. So this article is looking at scientific censorship as described in kind of the previous slide and that diagram up here in the corner. And they're trying to figure out why and how this happens so that we could slow that roll, as it were. The reality about scientific censorship is probably has to do more with self-preservation and, sadly, I hate this phrase, the greater good, because people use this as an excuse for bad behavior all the time. It's really obnoxious, but it's kind of part of that human nature thing, right? We're mostly good most of the time. And we're also very, very good at, well, we like to think that we're really good at helping people and seeing what the greater good is. But unfortunately, much of the time, our motivations are about what's good for us. And we don't even realize we're doing that. That would be a bias. When we talk about something like the greater good, the term that comes up a lot is noble lies. So the example of when you are lying about something like the efficacy of masks or a particular treatment for a given health thing, if you intentionally misrepresent that information because you think it's going to have good outcomes, well, that would be what we call a noble lie. I mentioned masks because there's a great article from Slate about noble lies that were told during the early days of the COVID pandemic. All right, and so with the masks, Anthony Fauci bent the truth a little bit about how effective they are and what kind of masks are effective. And he justified this by saying, well, I didn't want to have a run on masks. And that's usually what people say, is they don't want to have panic. They don't want people to freak out. But in reality, you can't really predict what's going to make people freak out. And you have a hard time predicting their behavior too. So the philosophy in health and medicine is, of course, as we've discussed previously in this class and others, honesty is probably the best policy, because when you're not honest, you're taking responsibility for people's health decisions that you're trying not to do. So that's the idea behind the noble lies. I don't think I had you read that article in this class, but that's kind of an overall summary. The prevailing opinion in public health, for example, is that, well, we should really be giving people the best information they have so that they can make their own choices. To do anything else is to take responsibility for people's choices. So that's not ideal. That's happening here if we're dishonest about censorship. But I think that this might, since we're talking about this pro-social stuff, what pops into my mind is this good old psychological concept of cognitive dissonance. Essentially, what cognitive dissonance means is people don't like being wrong. But let's talk about that a little bit, because we can have all the justifications in the world, but if they're not serving good intentions, and if they're not serving honesty, truth, and transparency, we've got problems. And I don't say that just because it's like, oh, you should all be good and honest. Well, there's a reason for that. There's a lot of reasons for that, as just discussed. But let's dig into cognitive dissonance a little bit. So again, in this article, they're talking about people making decisions for pro-social reasons. They are trying to preserve their image. They're trying to preserve their reputation. They're trying to protect people. They're trying to, they wouldn't want to accidentally provide ammunition to people who are working against the greater good. But again, when we're talking about science, this is not, there's not quite so many absolutes. The discussion, the arguments, that's part of the process. And every time we shut that down, we got problems. So anyway, what's cognitive dissonance? Well, this is coming from some really interesting experiments back in the 50s with Festinger. And essentially, the too long didn't read here is that we don't like to be wrong. Simple as that. Being wrong is identity threatening. It makes us feel like we don't know what's real. It makes us feel like we don't know who we are. It makes us feel stupid. Of course, we don't like to feel that way. We have some natural responses to that. One is we try not to be wrong. Another is that when we are wrong, we still try not to be wrong. So there are two major responses to cognitive dissonance. They look like this. One, rationalization. I had a really good reason for doing that thing that I did. Right? That's kind of that greater good argument. I had a really good reason. I didn't want you guys to freak out. And it's like, Okay, well, thank you for thinking so highly of us. Like, we would really like to get, that's not a right to keep that information from us, for instance, right? But that would be what rationalization looks like. Another one would be trivialization, which is a part of rationalization where it's like, well, it's not that big a deal. You're overreacting. Yeah, I was well intentioned. Well, we all know about the road to hell and good intentions and all that. Now, the other major response to cognitive dissonance is called confirmation bias. You've probably heard this before. It's been discussed in some other literature as motivated reasoning. But essentially, what you're doing is you're only paying attention to information that supports your view. These are behaviors that you're probably well acquainted with in yourself and others perhaps. But again, part of the nature of cognitive dissonance and other related psychological concepts such as fundamental attribution error is that this is something everyone else does, not me. I don't do that. Those guys over there, they're just bad people, right? That's another cognitive error. And so when it comes to something like cognitive dissonance, we tend to assume that other people do it. The original experiment in this was quite interesting. And this trips me up sometimes. So I had to actually just go double check because I thought I had it backwards in my head again. What he did is they had people do really boring stuff like, all right, every 15 minutes, turn this screw a quarter turn. We'll do that for like an hour. And they had three groups. They had a control group who didn't get any money. They had one group that got $1 and another group that got $20, right? And adjust this for inflation because this is like the 50s, right? What they found was the people who got paid the least amount of money when they were asked to describe the task to other people that would have to do it, they're like, all right, now write an essay and tell other students how great this task was. So obviously, asked to do a boring thing, not that great, but then asked to write an essay about how great it was. The students who got paid a little bit of money, they worked harder to convince other students that it wasn't bad, presumably because they felt bad. The students who got paid 20 bucks, well, they felt less bad about, like, well, it's justified. I've got the money, whatever. I guess I won't, I'll just, I'll type all day. But the students who got a little bit of money, they're like, God, why am I lying to these people for such a paltry sum? This was evidenced of what Festinger describes as cognitive dissonance. I think that's kind of hilarious in a cruel way, but it illustrates how squishy our perceptions of our social environment are, of reality being adjusted to our social environment and our expectations. And that can be a little bit alarming when we start thinking about the implications of how our unconscious desires for pro-social outcomes, approval, uh, things like shame, avoidance, things like that, how that can shape our actual outcomes. And scientists are not immune to this. So what's the solution? Well, according to the authors, the solution is more transparency. We need to have this process be transparent. The peer review process, uh, we got to watch the watchers, as it were. Well, hey, that's another dilemma. People are kind of naturally untrustworthy. So what do we do with this information? So transparency could work, but is that realistic given people's motivations? We can't expect people to hold themselves accountable. That's really hard for people to do. That is a practice skill, which I encourage you to do. I think you will be happier and your life will be better, but it doesn't come naturally to people to be like, whoops, I was wrong. That's a practice skill that we have to develop. So our job becomes improving accountability when it comes to something like scientific censorship. This may not be something that you feel like you have much power in, but I guess in some ways we're kind of viewing that right now. As of the recording of this video, the political climate is the new administration is taking the axe to a whole lot of federal funding institutions, and they're saying this is too corrupt. It's too bloated, it's too expensive, and it's not doing what it's supposed to do. Well, we might be throwing the baby out with the bathwater in some of these instances, but they're not wrong that these institutions are bloated and kind of corrupt, frankly. because that's what happens, right? The government gets too big, people get corrupt. The same thing happens with scientific institutions. And so it's really, really important, not necessarily to slash and burn everything. I'm not advocating for that. But what I am advocating for is we need to have some form of accountability and transparency because these systems naturally resist those things. That's what the scientific censorship problem is about. Now, again, you may not feel like you have much control over that unless I suppose you voted for this in this direction and that's, hey, that's what we wanted. We've got accountability. The system works in that way. Well, that's one argument, but maybe we don't feel super empowered to deal with this directly. We're not in that room with the peer review process necessarily. I mean, I know people in the room sometimes, but that's not the point. So what do we do with this at the individual level? Well, I think that it would really behoove everyone to recognize that we have to practice being honest. We have to want to be honest. And that's a really good start. That's a really good place to start. So I encourage you to think of life in that way. And maybe that feels a little philosophical, a little soapboxy, but again, hopefully what I'm illustrating to you here is that there's reasons for honesty and that they make it possible to accomplish things that are otherwise impossible to accomplish. That's the point of science. We're trying to systematize honesty. Anything that gets in the way of that is not helpful. It's compromising science in a way that we don't want it to do. So let's talk about robots now that we've talked about human biases. What about robot biases? Well, this is what most people spent most of their time talking about on the discussion boards. I'm not surprised by that. The scientific censorship article probably doesn't mean much to you, which is why I spent so much time explaining it. But let's talk about AI. Essentially, the too long didn't read on this one is that Mesko and Topol are arguing for greater regulation of AI in healthcare because right now there is none unless it goes through the FDA as like a medical device. We might need to do a little bit more than that, as the authors are pointing out. AI is already in use. However, large language learning models, the LLMs that we're discussing, or as I refer to them generally as generative AI throughout the course, these are kind of novel and they're getting better all the time. They're getting better so quickly that when this article came out last year or the year before, and I was talking about it, things were different when this article was written than they were last year. They're different last year than they are now. There are people actively working on generative AI, and I recall hearing the CEO of Anthropic, which is one of the more focused on preventing Terminator from becoming a reality kind of companies. The CEO of that company said that, well, this could be, we could get past the generative AI part of this to like kind of self-aware machines within the next year, like now. So this is changing so fast, and that raises a really important question for us. Because of the novelty of this, it makes it hard for us to know what to expect. Some companies, such as Anthropic, are trying to get out ahead of this and trying to say, all right, here's benchmarks for when the AI can do this thing, we have to institute this other safeguard. And then they have to adjust that as they go along. Some companies are trying to do that. But there is the possibility that this is exceeding our ability to do that, particularly when it comes to regulation, because regulation is slow, very slow. That's why, like, the past 4 presidents have been like, executive orders, executive orders, executive orders, because regulation takes so long. Now, that's not a good excuse for presidents to use executive orders, but that's the excuse they give, right? Whatever the reason, we're probably not prepared for the implications of AI. I think that's safe to say, particularly given like what this article is talking about. That we're using AI to summarize medical stuff. We're using it to look at sensitive documents and records, and there's just no real good way to do that and have it adhere to all the regulations already in place. Now, there's many benefits to this. It streamlines workloads. It facilitates communication across specialists, departments, workers, administrators. And it allows for big picture problem solving, the kind of skills that someone like me refines and someone like you is refining over the course of a college education. critical analysis, believe it or not, that's what you're supposed to be learning here, is to be able to look at these different articles. Even if you can't master them and understand all the methods, you can look at it, you can say, this is what's important about this, or this is what's important to me about this. I'm learning something, I can generate this. Well, AI is really good at that. Well, not synthesis, but it's good at summary. You may have noticed that. So you can use it for your schoolwork, sure. You can use it to summarize articles. You can use it to summarize the state of things, but it doesn't always do that right. And when it doesn't do that right, that has some big question marks in terms of safety and in terms of the truth, right? So us humans have some ways of dealing with that. But anyway, AI is good at doing a lot of this stuff. Theoretically, this can lead to things like better diagnosis if we're sticking with our healthcare example, right? The AI can look at pictures so big that this machine might be better at detecting things that the doctors just don't notice because of its attention to its ability to kind of squish things together. But when it squishes things together, it makes mistakes too. And it's worth reiterating, the AI is not human. How much does that matter? Well, that's a question that we are going to have to answer. It will be answered for us one way or another. Because the thing about humans is we're animals that we are the way we are for a reason. And part of that reason is millennia of trial and error. Whether or not you believe in evolution, we've got culture, we've got our species, we've got cognition, and we have a gut check. We are alive. We fear for our safety. We think about consequences in ways that a machine simply can't do. It doesn't have guts, so it doesn't have a gut check. That's metaphorically speaking, but it's also true. So when we see something that's like, well, that looks weird, that can help us figure out what's wrong. AI may not be able to do that yet. So speaking of things that look weird, another problem with AI that many have observed is that it has a tendency to hallucinate results. This is one of the first things that you will notice when you start to engage with it yourself for the class project, is that it can make stuff up when it's doing this digestive process. I have, with my probing of the AI when developing the class projects, I have seen this firsthand. It will give me a source and I'll be like, okay, can you provide me with a link to that source? And I'll be like, no, I cannot, because it turns out that source doesn't exist. And say, okay, but I can ask the AI, well, if this source doesn't exist, how did you give it to me? And it can describe the whole process by which it does that. Basically, it's taking results from one search, results from another, it's putting them together, and then it's mistaking something and giving that as a citation and confusing several studies for one big study. It's doing what it's taught to do, but it's doing it in such a way that it gives me something that doesn't work. That's inconvenient for research, but that could be a safety issue if we apply this to the healthcare system. And this is still something that's going on now. Now, the models are getting better all the time. They are being trained. Some of this depends on what they are trained on, right? You feed them information and then they can process it and they can learn. That's good news. However, this needs human intervention. I don't know if that's ever going to go away. I mean, humans make mistakes too, right? Obviously. But there's a problem if we take this as absolute truth without double checking it, particularly if we do that, again, extend that to the healthcare. So AI cannot do the job of a doctor. It might be able to help the doctor do the job, but the doctor still needs to really be able to check that. Here's a picture. I had Bing AI, the AI image generator, I guess it's called Gemini now. This is what I had it. I asked it, this is our course image, as you may have noticed, but I asked it to give me a picture illustrating a anti-inflammatory lifestyle. Well, this is impressive. This is like compositionally, technically, it looks like a painting. It looks realistic. It looks kind of interesting until you start looking closer and you see some things that shouldn't be. I'm not sure why this guy doesn't have skin. That's kind of important. And the fact that that's not something that flags the AI is like, oh, this guy should have skin, right? oh, this lady's wearing like an apron shirt and no shirt under it. Like there's beer on the table. Is this stuff that is inflammatory? Things that are not. I mean, assume that's beer. It looks delicious. The guy is holding a bottle of juice and there's hamburgers and everyone's like taunting him. Like so, you've got elements of what I asked it to do, but it fails the gut check. We know that immediately when we look at this picture. The machine doesn't. So that's the problem we have when that's a concern, right? It's funny when it does it with a picture. Less funny if it does it with a diagnosis. So AI doesn't yet have what I referred to previously as a gut check. That could be good, that could be bad. If our gut check is biased, as previously discussed with the other article, well, then it's good if the AI is more objective. However, if it can't compare its output to reality, that's a problem. So are we going to get ahead of this? If so, how? Uh, there is the tragic possibility that it's already too late. I'm not sure I buy that, but one way or another is it's an adventure, and we're going to see where this all leads, probably sooner than you think. But we want to think about this for our purposes in this class for thinking about the consequences and leveraging the good parts of our human nature. Yeah, we've got our biases, but we've got a lot of good qualities too. The fact that those biases may center more on pro-social desires rather than malice, well, that's a good thing, right? Now, if we can't prepare, if we can't get ahead of this, then we have to think about other ways to prepare for the future. So I don't know if that's like we got to worry about the robot uprising, but it might mean if the robot can only do the analysis part of the critical analysis, then you have to get better at the critical part of the critical analysis. That's probably the best thing we can do right now, which is a skill we're going to keep practicing in this class. So this is going to be your generation's internet revolution, assuming you're a younger generation than me. My generation, millennials, we lived through, dial-up internet and smartphones and all that, and this is going to be the game changer that completely rearranges the landscape of every aspect of how we live, probably in the next decade, if not sooner. So pay close attention to how it progresses and remember that you as a human have some real advantages and some real good qualities. And no matter how good machines get at doing human things, I believe that there is still going to be a part of us that is important. And no matter how good the machines get at doing our jobs, there are going to be things that only humans can do, and those are the sacred things about us. And so we can practice those skills. Again, the critical awareness, I think, is a great place to start. And think about what kind of ideal role you would like to fulfill as you go forward and as we integrate AI technology more and more into our lives. Well, hopefully this class will help you do that with its project and consideration. That's it for this video. I hope that you've learned something and hopefully it's not just all doom and gloom. But again, I think that there is something really important about what we are, who we are, and we should try to think about that and apply it as we go forward here. We have our limitations, machines have their limitations as well. But hey, that's what we're doing here is trying to negotiate the future. So we'll continue to explore the implications of communication for this. The fact that we do still communicate, well, that's a great thing. That's how we negotiate our reality. Biases and all, that's the only way we can really get to truth. Approximating it anyway, that's the goal of science. That's the goal of all of this. So we'll continue to explore those implications going forward. Thank you for stopping by, and I'll see you in the next video.